Hi, everyone, and greetings from Stanford. I am the Dean of Engineering, Jennifer Whittam, and I'm talking to you from my home here, very close to the Stanford campus. I'm delighted to be introducing the School of Engineering's first major virtual event for alumni. I understand we have more than 300 people registered for this event. I wanted to welcome you all. I just saw briefly who was people's typing in their locations in the chat, and you're coming from all over the place, but especially wanted to welcome those of you in Asia and Australia. We specifically scheduled this event at a time that we thought would make it convenient for us to bring a little bit of the School of Engineering to you. Like all of you here at Stanford, we're getting adjusted to new ways of doing things. Most of our undergraduates and some of our graduate students left the campus in early March, and all of us, the faculty, staff, students, are working from home. We've pivoted to new modes of teaching, of learning, and we're doing our best to continue our research. That also includes many new areas of research relevant to the virus. And if you look at the School of Engineering website, we've been keeping it up to date with much of the exciting research that we're doing around COVID-19. In general, we're all just finding new ways to collaborate, new ways to connect, both personally and professionally. I do feel quite confident our School of Engineering community will be stronger as a result. And I'm also pleased that we're finding new ways to connect with you, our alumni, who are so important to the school and the university. So thank you all for joining us today, and do be on the lookout for future virtual events in your time zone and all around the world. Today's discussion is titled Creativity with Constraints, and I would say it's quite appropriate to the times we're living in and the position we're all finding ourselves in. And I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker. Tina Seelig is a professor of the practice in the Department of Management Science and Engineering in the School of Engineering. She is the faculty co-director of the Stanford Technology Ventures program, which is the focal point for entrepreneurship education in the School of Engineering. Tina teaches courses on creativity, innovation, and entrepreneurship. She teaches in the MS&E department. She also teaches within the Hasso-Plattner Institute of Design at Stanford that many of you probably know better as the D School. Like all of you, Tina is a Stanford alum. She received her PhD in neuroscience from the School of Medicine. Tina has won several teaching awards. She's one of just 4 School of Engineering recipients of the Gordon Prize from the National Academy of Engineering. That's a very prestigious award that recognizes leaders in engineering education. And last but not least, recently in 2018, Tina received the Richard W. Lyman Award for extraordinary service to the Stanford alumni community. In other words, all of you. I'm sure you'll find today's discussion very interesting, and thank you again all for coming, whatever time zone you're in, wherever you're dialing in from. So we do look forward to the day we can host you again on campus for events and visits, but meanwhile, this is, we hope, second best. So welcome, Tina. We all look forward to your talk.
Great. Thank you so much, Jennifer. This is such a thrill. What a wonderful experiment, and I'm delighted to be the first speaker in this series. So today we're going to focus on creativity with constraints. Now, we are living in a world right now with lots of constraints, and the question is today, do those constraints hurt or do they help our creativity? And I'm hoping we're going to have an answer to that by the end of this hour that we're going to spend together, and we'll have a point of view about this. Now, you might think, wow, these constraints we have right now are just overwhelming. But constraints are actually really normal in our lives. We all live in a world where constraints are normal. We have time as a constraint. We don't always have time for the things we need to do. Money, nobody has all the funds they would fantasize having for the things they'd like to accomplish. Space, there are people who are often, especially right now, in tiny little spaces. Or water, there are places in the world where we don't have enough water to drink, or people who have health problems, or certainly there are people who have some food insecurity. So constraints are things that we deal with all the time. But right now, in the world today, everything has been thrown up in the air. And as a result, it has forced us to question everything. We have been pushed out of our comfort zone, and essentially it makes us look at everything with fresh eyes. And I'm reminded of one of the famous creativity puzzles that we're often taught about how might we connect all of these dots using only 4 lines. This 9-dot problem is often used as an example of thinking outside the box. Because if you really want to connect all these 9 dots with a minimum or maximum of 4 lines without lifting the pen off the paper, you're going to have to think outside the box. In fact, the concept or the idea of thinking outside the box came from this puzzle. But what if you're living in a time right now where you can't think outside the box? We are constrained to the box. We're told, no, you can't go out. You can't do the things that you would hope to do to solve a problem. You need to think inside the box. And that's where we are right now with all of these constraints. At this point, we look at not what we want to have, but we look at what we do have. And that's what constraints do. They force us to look at what we do have at our disposal as opposed to the things that we don't and want to have. So there are lots of examples of places where we have to look at what we do have and come up with amazingly fabulous solutions. One of my favorite examples comes from Apollo 13. Now, the Apollo 13 story, if you don't know it, and many of you have probably seen the movie, is that this was in 1970, and there was a terrible accident on board the spaceship, and one of the oxygen tanks blew up. And as a result, the oxygen levels on the spaceship started decreasing, the carbon dioxide started increasing. The astronauts were at great risk. They were losing their mental abilities. They were going to lose consciousness, and clearly they were going to die. So the scientists who were back at NASA had to figure out how to solve this problem. There were huge constraints. First of all, there were lives at stake. They had limited time to solve the problem. And guess what? Nobody had thought about this problem happening. No one had even considered that this would be something that would happen. And so the parts that they needed did not exist on the spaceship. And so down at NASA, they basically threw on the table all the things they did have on the ship, as opposed to the things they thought they really needed, and said, we better figure it out. And remarkably, in short time, they figured out how to solve the problem and save the lives. Incredible. The creativity that resulted from these constraints was powerful. But you can look at lighter examples as well. One of my favorite examples comes from Monty Python. We probably have some Monty Python fans in the audience. And in Monty Python and the Holy Grail, the script was written in such a way that they were supposed to have a beautiful knight coming over a hill, riding a very strong big horse. Now that sounds like a really nice idea, doesn't it? But the budget did not allow for a horse. They just looked and said, there's no way we can do this. So they thought and thought, and they thought and said, well, how could we simulate a horse? How can we have a horse without a horse? So one of the actors said, well, you know what? What if we bang 2 coconut shells together? And they did it, and they went clomp, 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 clomp. It sounded just like a horse. And in fact, this ended up becoming one of the most iconic and funniest scenes in any Monty Python movie. And in fact, it would never have happened if they actually had the resources to get a horse. And this is really important. We also see this often in companies as well, where companies that have way too much money spend it in ways that probably are not smart, whereas those that have real constraints end up coming up with clever and efficient ways to solve those problems. But this idea of using constraints has been around for centuries. Let's go back to haiku in Japan. Haiku is poetry that has a very clear constraint. There can only be 5 syllables in the first line, 7 syllables in the second, and 5 syllables in the third. And you need to tell a story. And usually the story should be about something that's important and profound and based in concepts around nature. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples that show you the power of this short little poem with a 5-7-5 constraint. This one, this is a very famous old haiku. An old silent pond. A frog jumps into the pond. splash, silence again. What a wonderful metaphor. Hopefully it's a metaphor for what's going on right now. A frog has certainly jumped into our pond. Hopefully there'll be silence again at some point. Or how about this one? A world of dew. A world of dew, and within every dewdrop, a world of struggle. You can read this many times over, and it's very profound, all captured in this tiny little poem. Now, coming a little bit more to recent times, let's look at another constraint, the 6-word memoir. Now, apparently, Ernest Hemingway was asked, could he tell his life story in only 6 words? And he said, well, of course. And his life story, told in 6 words, was for sale, baby shoes, never worn. What a sad tale, isn't it? In fact, I often have my students introduce themselves to each other at the beginning of the new course by telling their own 6-word memoir. And I want to share a couple examples of 6-word memoirs, not for my students, but some that I found online that I thought were particularly interesting. This is one. I am disabled, but not helpless. Wonderful story, nice life story. How about stuck on repeat? Stuck on repeat. Or a third one, hobby became job, seeking new hobby. Now, for many of us, there's another tool that we all use that has a lot of constraints. What about Twitter? You know, when Twitter first started, just a few years ago, essentially, people thought, what are you talking about? You know, writing messages that have only 140 characters, what is this all about? But having these constraints has unleashed a tremendous amount of creativity. And people have found this to be a wonderful way to communicate with the world and spent a lot of time crafting very short tweets that communicate a tremendous amount. One of my favorite examples is someone who actually writes recipes on Twitter, only 140 characters, an entire recipe. Kind of clever, and I bet we could all read this and replicate this recipe. In fact, I recently, as a result of the constraints that we're having now in the world, decided to use Twitter to see if I could teach an entire course on Twitter. And I thought, what would that be like? What would be the minimum viable course? What would be the minimum viable class would be on Twitter? So I'm going to give you an example. I decided to call each class a jolt. And this was the first tweet I put out. It says, join me for a series of bite-sized classes, jolts, delivered only with tweets. Each jolt will include a short video and a tiny assignment. All video clips are taken from our vast eCorner collection and the hashtag creativity rules. So I posted this on April 30th, and I decided I was going to do this for an entire month. So 1 month, the month of May, I woke up one morning, came up with this idea, and started it the next day. I'm going to show you examples of a few of my classes. So this is class number 5 with Bonnie Simi, and the class is Inspiring Story of Bonnie Simi, who turned a crazy dream of competing in the Olympics into reality with tiny experiments. And there's a clip there, a short little clip, maybe 3 minutes long, of Bonnie telling an amazing story, how when she was a Stanford student, she decided that she'd actually decided when she was 10 years old that she at some point wanted to be in the Olympics. And the opportunity came up for her to apply to be a torchbearer. And so she actually used her application that she had written to get into Stanford. She modified it and ended up becoming a torchbearer at the Olympics in Mount Placid. Well, so when she was there, she thought, I don't think this really counts as being in the Olympics, even though I'm at the Olympics. So after the Olympics were over, she was taking a leave that quarter so she could participate. She found there was a school that was teaching luge, $8 for a luge lesson. She thought, I could afford that. So she did it and realized after a couple times, she could probably master this. And to make a long story short, she ended up competing 4 years later in luge. Amazing, in the Olympics. Started out with a dream she had at 10 years old, and ended up years later making it happen. So the homework here was, what's your big dream and what's the smallest step you can take in that direction? And so people post all their answers to this problem in this class. Another one was way back when we went to the Wayback Machine to 2005, a video clip of Mark Zuckerberg at the early days of Facebook. And the class lesson was, try lots of things and see what works. Here's a classic clip of Mark Zuckerberg from 2005 talking about his experimenting with coding while in college. And the homework here is, what little experiment can you do this week? So each of these is a prompt and amazing responses. And a third one I'll share with you. This is a more recent one from Astro Teller, who is the head of Google X. And this is his fascinating insights on why and how to celebrate failure at Google. This is an amazing about, he really wants to encourage people to be willing to give up on projects that are not working and give up on them before they've invested a huge amount of time and effort. As soon as they figured out something really won't work, they actually have a celebration for people who are willing to quit their projects. It's an amazing video, and I encourage all of you to take a look at it. And I also invite all of you to take part in this course. It's still going on, and all of the information is on my Twitter feed, which is @tseelig. I would love to see any of you in the class. So I've had lots and lots of opportunities to experiment with creativity with constraints. This is a picture from San Quentin State Prison up in Marin. I have been teaching entrepreneurship and innovation at San Quentin for the last 5 years. And you might wonder, how did I get involved with this? Well, it turns out that the founders of a program called The Last Mile gave a talk at Stanford. And I listened to it, and it was so moving. They teach coding at San Quentin. And I reached out to them and said, you know, coding is fabulous. I'm delighted they're learning this, but wouldn't it be great if they were also learning entrepreneurship? And they invited me to come up and participate. And I've been doing this now for 5 years. And the last couple of years, I've involved my students in the class. In fact, I've done several classes where the students have done projects on redesigning the experience of going from prison to freedom. And last year, I did a class where we literally had a live link between my class at the D School and the classroom at San Quentin. And we had 16 students at Stanford and 16 men at San Quentin who were working together on teams. It was an incredibly powerful experience. So last quarter, I taught a class, just me teaching the men at San Quentin. And they went through the entire process of learning how to go from the seeds of an idea all the way through implementation. And the project I gave them was on wildfires. Now you might say, why wildfires? Well, I wanted to pick something that was relevant for them. Now, why was this relevant? Well, first of all, many of the men have family members who live in areas that were affected by the California wildfires. Also, a lot of the men in prison work alongside as volunteers, alongside the firefighters who are fighting the fires. They go out there as volunteers. And also, you can imagine when you're in prison and the smoke comes, you can't leave. So they're very personally affected by the wildfires. So each of the teams had to pick a problem related to wildfires to work on over the quarter. Some of the teams picked projects such as how could they prevent wildfires? Others focused on how could they detect wildfires really early so that they could be put out before they became big. And other teams focused on how might they help people evacuate if they were stuck in their home and a fire was coming. So toward the end of the course, I taught them how to tell a story and how to share their ideas in a really compelling way. And I told them they needed to do their final presentations in the form of a video, a short video, 1.5 minutes long. And they looked at me and they said, I don't know how to do that. We don't have any video cameras. We don't have any editing tools. We don't have the software. We don't have any of those things. And I said, you know what? Creativity loves constraints. You have some constraints here. I bet you're going to figure it out. This is part of the class, figuring out how you can make a video. So I left, and I came back 2 weeks later and was completely blown away by what they had done. I was moved to tears by their presentations. So I'm going to show you one with you so you can get a sense of the quality and the creativity of what they did. Pretty cool, right? I was so impressed, and I have to say that one of the things that the men learn is that they can do all the things that the Stanford students can do. The confidence they gain from being able to tackle the problems, the same sort of problems that our students tackle, leads them to realizing that they have a tremendous amount of potential once they get out of prison. So one of the things that this reminds us is that constraints stimulate our imagination. And this is something that all of us are dealing with right now. I have been blown away by the amount of creativity that has been unleashed during this pandemic. I have a group of friends that gets together every Saturday night now. And this is something, of course, we never did before. We saw each other maybe once or twice a year. And now every Saturday night we're on Zoom and we give each other challenges, creative challenges. Sometimes it's writing a limerick or a haiku. Sometimes it's doing artwork. And one of the challenges one week was to do the Getty Challenge. Now, you might be familiar with this. The Getty Museum put out a challenge during this shelter-in-place time saying, can you replicate a piece of artwork using the things you have around your house? And my friends took this on with great enthusiasm. One of my friends reproduced Whistler's Mother, pretty amazing. I think it's great, especially with the Corona bottle at the added prompt. Or this is Frida Kahlo. This is actually her daughter, just as Frida Kahlo. Pretty remarkable. Here is a Wayne Thiebaud painting with face masks. And of course, you've got Van Gogh's sunflowers with kitchen utensils. In fact, we are all seeing tremendous creativity, whether it's in people doing, finding ways to entertain each other and to entertain us, to also the really important task of doctors collaborating with incredible constraints around the world. Things that they might have not have found the ability to do it before, but they said, you know what, this is so important. Even with the constraints we have to figure out a way across cultures, across languages, across borders to solve these problems. This is something I spend a lot of time teaching my students. Just happens to be a picture from one of my classes. The students are doing a project where they're wearing different colored hats, where they are essentially constrained to thinking in a certain way. This is De Bono's 6 hats model I'm doing here. And in order to solve a problem. But I give them lots and lots of opportunities to learn how to tap into their creativity with constraints so that when they go out into the world and have constraints, they can look at this as a stimulant as opposed to an inhibitor. So what would be some examples of experiments I give them to do, or exercises? One might be giving them a random object. Now, what is this about? I will tell them that they need to pick a problem in their life, any problem they want. And then they have to pick a random object in their environment, in their room, in their bedroom, in their kitchen, whatever it is, and they have to figure out how that random object is going to help them solve the problem. That's quite a constraint, isn't it? They come up with amazing ways in which these random things can solve their problems. My favorite example was a young woman who was moving that weekend, and she had to get a piece of furniture out of her apartment and moved across the Bay Bridge to her new apartment. Well, her car wouldn't fit this. She couldn't lift it. She didn't have any friends around who had a car or truck or anything to move this, and she felt stuck. And she knew that if she could not move this piece of furniture, she was going to have to leave it there. So she thought, how am I going to do this? This is a real problem. So she looked around her room and she said, okay, there's a leftover case of wine from a going away party. How is that case of wine going to help me move this piece of furniture? She thought for a second and said, oh my goodness, I'm going to go on Craigslist. She went on Craigslist and said, I have a free case of wine for anyone who can help me move this piece of furniture over the Bay Bridge. And you know what? Within a few hours, it was moved. This is a reminder that we have all of these things around us all the time, but we don't see them through the lens of possibility until we actually choose to focus that way. Another example would be in a brainstorming session, I might have the students come up with not the best ideas they can, but the worst ideas they can. Wow, that is quite a constraint. You can't come up with any good ideas. You have to come up with bad ideas. So, for example, I might give them the challenge of coming up with the worst idea possible for a family vacation. Well, here's an idea. How about being stuck at home for weeks during a pandemic? That sounds like a pretty horrible idea, right? But you know what? They could come up with then fabulous things that a family would do being stuck at home, turning it into maybe lots of really fun games they design or create a fantasy world, whatever they want to do, figure out ways to communicate with people online and to turn this worst idea into something brilliant. And we can see that right now. There are many people who are finding the opportunities while we're being stuck at home during this pandemic. And a third example is giving teams a random object. So instead of having them pick it, I give them a random object. It might be a handful of paper clips. It might be water bottles. It might be Post-it notes. And I tell them their job is to create as much value as possible, value measured any way they want, starting with this mundane object. Now, this is an object that they normally would throw away, they thought was garbage, but I now want them to look at it instead of as something that's a constraint, look at it through the lens of possibilities. And amazing things happen. In fact, this turned into an innovation challenge that went from my classroom across campus and turned into a global innovation tournament. And each year we would unveil a new object, and teams all the way around the world in classrooms and in clubs all around the world would work on the same challenge at the same time. So I'm going to show you an example of one of the projects that came out of this challenge when the specific challenge was Post-it notes. And they all also, again, have to be videos. I love for students to have to make videos because it gets their story down to a very short period of time, has to be really concise with great storytelling. This short video about unplugging appliances that were not being used ended up being watched thousands of times, and I know lots of people ended up making the decision that, you know what, I better unplug things when I go away because look, think about how much energy I'm saving. So all of this comes down to the point that we are surrounded by so many things that can unlock our creativity. And when we have constraints, instead of looking outside at the things we wish we had, we are really forced to look inside at the things we do. And I love this quote from Proust, which really captures this in a beautiful way. The real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in seeing with new eyes. And the constraints allow us to see the world in a brand new way. The fact is, we all live in a world with constraints all the time. Right now, we've really been pushed out of our comfort zone by all the constraints that have been forced upon us. But I was thinking about this a lot recently and realized we always say that necessity is the mother of invention, but maybe that's true, but maybe constraints are the father. And with the necessity and the constraints together, amazing, amazing things happen, and we unlock remarkable creativity. Thank you very, very much. So I would be delighted to take questions. I'm going to turn this off, turn off my screen. Great, and perfect. And are we all together now? Perfect.
Yep. And we have some questions already. And for those of you who are willing, if you want to put in the Q&A box where you're writing from, that might just be fun for people to see how far and why people are watching from. So the first question, Tina, you mentioned that we are now being forced into constraints by the pandemic. Are there instances in which you would encourage people to adopt constraints voluntarily? And if so, what instances would those be?
Yeah, I think it's really, really important. I teach a class this quarter on creativity and innovation, and I have a wonderful co-instructor, Alberto Savoia, and he's coined the term Pretotype. A Pretotype is a tiny, tiny little experiment that you use to test your ideas for a new product or a new service. And the reason you use a Pretotype is you want to have all those constraints to do something tiny, tiny little to make sure you're doing the right thing before you scale it. And the constraints that you have in this case are very, very important, because if you have a lot of money, you have a lot of time, you have a lot of technical skill, you're often find yourself wanting to use that in order to try things out in a really big way. But it's much more important to do a little tiny experiment and give yourself those constraints to see if you're working on the right thing before you scale it. So does that make sense? Right.
So here's a question that I think a lot of people might have is, what if I'm not the creative type?
Oh my goodness, what if you're not the creative type? I mean, that is just such an interesting question. People often ask me, can you really teach creativity? Well, of course you can teach creativity, and everyone can get better at it. When we're kids, we're all creative. For the person who wrote that, I'm sure that they were creative as a child. One of the biggest problems is that our education system is not necessarily tuned to encourage creativity. We end up in school where we have lots of examples of tests with one right answer, with multiple choice tests, and you're filling it out with a number 2 pencil. Very, very rigid responses. I encourage you to find problems that are open-ended and to stretch your imagination. Let me tell you a fun little story. So I wrote a book. I've written a bunch of books, and one of them is called What I Wish I Knew When I Was 20. And in fact, I realized there's a copy of it sitting right over here. And the book became very popular in Asia. And I was asked to do a TV series in Japan. So maybe some of the folks who are on this class right now participated or watched this series on NHK in Japan. And we shot the whole thing at the D School at Stanford. So afterwards, they said, this is wonderful, we love it, but it would never work in Japan. And I said, what are you talking about? They said, well, our students are just not so creative. And I said, that just can't be the case. So they said, prove it. So I said, okay, fine. So I went to Osaka University in Japan, and I taught 2 days there. Now, not really 2 full days. I did 2 hours, and then I gave a challenge, and the next day the students had to present it. So I had a tiny little intervention, a tiny little class of 2 hours. And I gave them a challenge. It was a challenge like the Post-it note challenge. But I gave them the challenge that their job was to create as much value as possible, starting with the contents of a trash can. Now, why did I choose a trash can? This was right after the tsunami, the earthquake and the tsunami and the nuclear power plant meltdown. There was a lot of, garbage in Japan, and people were feeling very, very bad about the state of the world. So I thought, let's pick something that has no value, in fact, has negative value, and let's see what sort of value you can create. The things the students did were amazing. And they walked out saying, I had no idea I was this creative. And all I had done was to set the stage and give them permission to use these skills. So when someone says, I'm not that creative, I would urge you to look at the environment you're in as well as your mindset. And if you can change those 2 things, you can absolutely unlock your creativity.
So here's an interesting question for many of us who have children at home as a result of the pandemic. And you mentioned our educational system. What are some ways that individuals as parents can help nurture our children's creativity? And related to that is, how is applying constraints in parenting to promote creativity different from normal constraints in parenting?
Well, let me just answer the question, what can we do right now? I mean, what a perfect time to really foster creativity in your kids. Everything has been broken, right? We're now in a world where everything has been thrown up in the air, and it comes down, and we get a chance to rebuild it. We get a chance to choose what our day-to-day life is going to be like. I mean, it's really remarkable. I've actually come to think that this situation now is an interesting Rorschach test, kind of an ink blot test about who we are, because all of us are responding to the situation in really different ways. And you can choose to say, I'm going to use this as an opportunity to help unlock my family's creativity, whether it's about cooking a meal. Maybe you do, I'm a fan of cooking shows on TV like Chopped, where you pick 3 or 4 random objects and think what you can do. Well, surely you can do that with your family. You can say, okay, I'm going to do the challenge tonight. I'm going to pick out 4 things, and my other family member is going to figure out what to make for dinner with them. That'd be kind of fun, right? I mean, you could pick a bunch of things and say, we're going to make an art project. I mean, I'm going to pick the materials, and you need to figure out what to do with it. You could create games. So many things that you could do. I've seen children around my neighborhood going around with chalk and creating chalk gardens, or putting notes of positive notes that they're writing around the road. Some folks went and painted a rainbow across the street and had all the kids put their handprints at the end of the rainbow. So I think right now you really are just limited by your imagination in terms of the things you do with your kids at home during this time.
Thank you. So 2 questions that are related. The first is, do you yourself have a creativity practice? And the second is, could you share a story of when you were able to shatter through some of your own assumptions and become more creative in the process?
Great. So I'll answer the first one first. And if I forget the second one, you can ask it. Okay, again. So do I have my own creativity practice? Yes, I do. I mean, I think the most common thing I say is, I have an idea. I'm generating ideas all the time. But one of my favorite things I do these days is I do collage. And I'm probably looking at a whole bunch of things that are here. If I could grab things around the room, you would see they're just a little bit out of sight. I started a project. Well, let's see, I'm 62. And so I started it, I guess, about 3 years ago, a project called 60 Weeks to 60. And in the 60 weeks up until my 60th birthday, I gave myself a different challenge every single week. Okay. And it was really fun. Sometimes it was like make a little movie, or do make some artwork, or one time I started working with a speaking coach. I mean, I did all sorts of things. It wasn't just art. It was ways to look at what I was doing in different ways. And the week that I gave myself the challenge of making art every day, I had a stack of New Yorker magazines next to my bed. And I got up in the morning and I said, well, these covers are kind of interesting. And so I just started cutting the covers up and making collages. And that actually has turned into an enormous collection I have of, do you want to see one? You want to see? Okay, I'll just grab some. Let's see. Okay, here's one. I just grabbed one of, this is, can you see it? New Yorker covers. They're all different ones, ranging from little tiny ones to really big ones, and it's super fun because that is the constraint I have, is I have to start with New Yorker covers, and then I see what they turn into. I
see a comment here that says, wow, it's amazing. So I will echo the wow, it's amazing, Tina. And related to that, the second question is, was there a time when you had some assumptions for yourself that you needed to shatter, and as a result became more creative in the process?
Oh my gosh, so many things. I mean, I grew up in a family where there were definitely right answers. I'm sure that my parents, when I was in utero, were saying, you're going to be a doctor, you're going to be a doctor. I had a lot of expectations, and I needed to break them. I realized that it was my job to define the life that I wanted. And I did a lot of things that did not make my parents happy early on. I started graduate school actually back east. And I just realized after one semester, I did not want to be there. I was doing this for my parents and not for me. And I really didn't want to be there. I picked up my few items that I owned, put in the back of the car along with my cat, and I drove across the country and moved to Santa Cruz, California, and I needed to be a leaf in the wind for a while. And then what ended up happening is after a while, started realizing I really wanted to get back into doing research. I wrote letters to every single faculty member at Stanford who was in the neuroscience department. I got letters like with stamps and, addresses. There was no email at the time. Letters back from every one of them saying, no, they didn't have an opportunity for me. But somebody passed my letter on to someone else, and they passed on to someone else. And I got a phone call, real phone call saying, gosh, we're looking for a research assistant to help out in the operating room. They had invented, in fact, anyone who knows about this is a very famous invention at the med school, the oximeter, the oximeters that people put on their fingers to measure oxygen saturation in the blood. That was invented at Stanford, and they were doing all the clinical trials, and they needed a research assistant. And I jumped at the chance, moved up here, and the rest is history. I ended up ultimately transferring into the neuroscience program, and it was the best decision. And the reason, I never, ever would have been able to do that if I wasn't able to challenge the assumption that I needed to stay on this very clear path and not take a break. And taking that break ended up becoming the smartest thing I ever did.
One of the audience members asked if you've heard of the film, The 5 Obstructions. If the person says it follows exactly the philosophy of your session.
Oh, wonderful. It's called The 5 Obstructions?
The 5 Obstructions. And I will, they shared a Wikipedia link, which I will send you
wonderful.
later.
I definitely want to read it. Yeah. Did the person write what was resonant?
It does not say, but
it does not say.
Back.
Okay. Well, now that's a great teaser.
But the other question that's related to it is, do you have any favorite recent books or research papers or articles on creativity that you might share?
Oh my gosh. Well, you know what? I'm going to give a plug for my friend Alberto, who I mentioned before. He wrote a book called The Right It. And I think it is absolutely brilliant. It takes you through the process of how you actually do little tiny experiments to see if you're on the right path for an idea. One of the biggest problems I see with young and older innovators is they come up with an idea and they think that needs to be instantly big, and then they get paralyzed because they don't know where to start. This book is about how do you start? What is the first things you do to help you understand if there really is a market for what you've invented and if you're going in the right direction. So it's called The Right It.
Okay. So here's a very important question. Most of the creative brainstorming techniques and aids are visual. This excludes people with visual disabilities, like the person who wrote the question. Do you have some inclusive brainstorming or creativity techniques so that persons with disabilities can participate fully and independently?
Well, that's a really good question. That's a fascinating constraint, isn't it? Because, and I think if we sat down and did some brainstorming around that, we'd come up with lots of ideas. Clearly, brainstorming involves a lot of talking. So, and I'd love to know from the person who's visually impaired how they like to capture ideas. You know, what is the way they capture it? Are they typing it? You know, is it Braille? It would be really interesting to know what is the preferred way of capturing ideas, because of course when we're brainstorming we're usually talking. So but you know, that's an interesting point. If somebody is hard of hearing, you know, how do you brainstorm with someone who can't hear well? I have to say, one of the things that I have been so excited about in using Zoom is I've been using the Zoom whiteboard feature in my classes to do brainstorming. And why is that great? It is great because it's anonymous. One of the issues that comes up in brainstorming is a sense of ownership for ideas. You know, well, that was my idea and that was your idea and my idea is better than your idea. But when it's anonymous, all of a sudden the ideas are much more, well, you can look at them much more objectively. So I love to put up a whiteboard at the end of my classes and have everyone write down their biggest takeaways, or if we've got a problem we're going to solve, I put it up and we instantly get, you know, dozens and dozens of solutions. So I found that that's something, if people are interested in doing brainstorming, I found that Zoom is a really helpful tool for that.
One of the participants says you could do a verbal whiteboard, also a word shower.
How do you do that? I'd love to know. A word shower.
Okay, chat person, send it back in.
Okay, yeah, exactly.
So here's an interesting question too. Some constraints are dynamic. They tighten with time. So for example, you're running out of money, your savings, if you're unemployed, or you're running out of time as you approach a deadline. How do you mitigate the effect of the increasing stress that comes with the tightening on your creativity?
So it's interesting. Some people might view it as stressful. Some people find it very stimulating. I was laughing at myself today. I was really laughing because I had Tuesday's my day. I have full day of classes, and Wednesday I don't have any classes. So I had a lot of flexibility on what I was going to work on today. And I knew I was going to be giving this talk tonight. And I waited until 5 o'clock to start working on it. And I was laughing. Why did I do that? Because I wanted the energy that came from having some time constraints. And I know this about myself, that I knew I had enough time. I mean, we weren't going to get together until 8:30, but I waited until the end of the day to have just enough creative pressure to make it interesting. And I find that for a lot of projects, students do that too. One of the things I do in my classes, because I know that students wait till the end, is that it used to be that I gave one term project and they'd wait until the last week to work on it. Then I said, okay, fine, I'm going to give 2 term projects, and they did better when I gave 2 term projects, because they still were going to wait till the end, but now they got a chance to do 2 of them. So the point is, I think if you can look at that constraint as a stimulant as opposed to a stress, you end up being in a much better place. And obviously that's much easier if it's not that you're running out of money and you're going to be homeless. I mean, I get it. We're living in a world now where some of these constraints are really, really earth-shattering. And I think it's very important for us to distinguish between those life or death types of constraints, and like, I can't breathe, or I'm going to be homeless, versus the constraint of, okay, how much time do I have for this presentation? And I think we just have to be honest about that.
Do you think there's a limit to constraints? At a certain point, does it actually constrain creativity?
My guess, and of course I haven't done research on this, but my guess is it's really different from each person. And that some people, listen, the television series Naked and Afraid. I mean, honestly, I would never want those constraints. I don't know how many people have you seen that, where they take two people, right, and no clothes, no food, no water. They throw them in some, crazy location and they have to survive for 21 days. I mean, these people have chosen these incredible constraints to try to figure out how to survive. So that's a very extreme example. Others of us, other types of constraints would be overwhelming. So I think understanding your own constraint profile, that just as we think of our own risk profile, we can have our own constraint profile.
One of our audience members asked about the Post-it notes behind you. Are they connected to your constraints?
So you know why I put them up there? I've been teaching on Zoom all quarter, and having just a whiteboard ended up being just a little bit too stark. So I just had fun. The first day of class, I actually tried to just write like hello with the Post-its, and it didn't really work out, and it just turned into a big mass of color. But it makes me happy having some Post-its, and it's sort of symbolic that we should be generating ideas all the time.
One of our audience members says, I like to be creative all day, but then I realize I don't get any results. How do I balance being creative and channeling that towards something useful?
I'm sorry, will you say it again? I think I interrupted.
Yeah, so I like to be creative, but then I realize I don't get any results. How do I balance being creative and channeling that towards something that's useful?
Okay, so one of the things we talk about in the design process is sort of the flare and then focus process, like flare and focus. The flare is coming up with ideas, but then at some point you need to focus and make it happen. And knowing when you should stop generating ideas and when you now have to say which one I'm going to work on. This is a really powerful set of skills that you need to develop to be able to do both. If you're just generating ideas and filling up walls and walls with Post-it notes and ideas, that might make your room decorative, but you're not going to actually accomplish anything. So being able to know when to stop generating ideas and say, okay, now it's time for me to pick one that I'm going to focus on, at least to its logical conclusion, do a little experiment and see if it's a good idea. So it's a really good point. And being able to do that is very important.
Switching gears a little bit, can you talk about any collaborations you may have done with engineering colleagues, and in particular, how you've channeled your creativity into engineering projects?
Sure. So the thing that comes to mind is a program that I run called the Excel Innovation Scholars Program. This is a 9-month program for PhD students in engineering. These are all very highly technical PhD students who are, coming up with inventions and technology that is going to change the world, and teaching them how to be creative problem solvers and how to bring their ideas to the market. So it's a program where every other week we go to a different company and we do a living case study on how a strategic issue that company is facing, and the students get a chance to actually try to crack that case and figure out what they would do. And then the alternate weeks, they're doing skill building, brainstorming, team dynamics, ethics, leadership skills. And the idea is that this collaboration allows them to be able to say, how do they take the ideas in their lab and to really think about how can they bring them to market in a really meaningful way. So instead of it being one-on-one, I like to help lots of students figure out how to move their projects forward.
How do you decide, or how do you encourage people to decide when to walk away from a project design and go in a different direction?
Super interesting, really interesting problem. When should you be persistent and walk through walls to say, oh my gosh, we're going to make this work? And when do you say, give up? This is one of the hardest problems ever, because you never know, do I just push a little bit more and we're going to have a breakthrough, Or is this something that I should really give up in order, just like I talked about Astro Teller, giving up on the idea, celebrate it to free you up to do something else? This is something you really have to listen to your gut. I think we tend to know if we're quitting because it's not going to ever work, or we're quitting because we don't have the fortitude. And I know that I've quit a lot of projects in my life. In some cases, it was the wrong thing to do. I did it because I was scared, or I didn't know easily what to do next, and it was easier to quit. And I look back on those situations and say, I wish I had had more perseverance. There are other times when I've had projects that I've quit and I thought, you know what, that's a good idea. In fact, I recently returned a book advance. I had a contract for a book, and I'm not one who doesn't follow through with commitments. You know, I've written 17 books, and I looked at this project and I said, I don't want to write this book. And it took me a long time to make the decision to, literally write a check and send it back. But it was the best decision because it freed me up to be able to take on lots of other projects that are quite different than writing a book.
So we have about 10 more questions here, but we don't have time for all of them. So I will, as a last question, there was one that came in twice, once at the beginning and once at the end, which is, what inspired you to make this presentation?
So it usually takes me a long time. I usually spend almost a year, now that may sound crazy, perfecting new presentations, like a concept, an idea. But this was something, as this situation was unfolding, I said, I need to put together a presentation on creativity with constraints. And it's interesting because I've been asked to give it now a few times. I have to say I was a little bit nervous at the beginning. It's a little tricky giving a talk as a webinar when you don't see everybody. I have to say that's an interesting constraint, but it's a topic I think we all need to think about. We are in a world where we can look at the glass as half empty and I don't have what I need, or we can look at it as half full and to say, what do I have? And this was my way of putting together a talk to help people see the possibilities in front of them. And also for me, this is, it was a way for me to look at the world as that way, through that lens as well.
Okay. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I know there are many other questions. Tina, are there any last words that you would like to share before we wrap things up?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to do this. It was really, really my pleasure. I invite anyone to reach out to me. I do my best to answer. I'm at tseelig@stanford.edu. You can certainly follow me on Twitter. And if you want to do the little course I've put together, it's about 2/3 of the way through. You can look at 20 of the little lessons. I would be delighted to get any feedback on that. And if there are any students, I don't know if there are any students who might be on here, or any people who are know Stanford students. I'm doing another little experiment. Last week I woke up and I said, think of all these students at Stanford and around the world who have lost summer internships. What would it look like if I offered every single student a summer internship? I mean, it was kind of a crazy idea. And then I thought, well, maybe I could do that. And so came up with the idea. We have a very large collection, a large library of video clips and podcasts and articles all about innovation and entrepreneurship. And one of the things that I have wanted is to have collections of them, have them curated into collections around different topics. And so I thought, why don't I offer any student who wants to work on a summer internship helping to mine this material and to create collections. And so I just did a little experiment. I wrote a blog post. It's this, SIP, shelter in place. Well, this is SIP summer internship program, our virtual summer internship program. And I wrote a little blog post, put it up on Medium, posted on Twitter, and within one day I had 85 students who had signed up. So we are bringing it to life, and it's going to be great fun. We're going to put them on teams to work together. So if you know any students who want to dive into this material, you can take a look at the STVP website or look at my Twitter feed. So this has been great. I wish we had more time to answer questions. That's the most fun part of this.